Well, this week is NAIDOC Week in Australia, which is a time to celebrate the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This year's edition comes at a time of reckoning. Just days ago, a landmark Aboriginal-led inquiry found that Indigenous people in the state of Victoria have suffered genocide and crimes against humanity since the beginning of colonisation, and they're still being impacted by systemic injustice today as a result. The report included 100 recommendations to redress harm, though several of the authors disagreed with these unspecified key findings. To talk more about this, I'm joined on set by Romain Fathi, who's a historian and senior lecturer at the Australian National University. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start then with this inquiry. Can you tell us a bit more about the key takeaways?
Yes, as with many other countries, South Africa, Cambodia, Vietnam, Australia set up some reconciliation or truth-telling commission. That of Victoria is one of several. There used to be one in Queensland that has been dismantled by the newly appointed government. In Victoria, that process started several years ago, and as you've mentioned, the report has been released very recently, a week and a half ago. Part of that report documents what happened to Indigenous Australians in Victoria. One of the key takeaway is the fact that between the 1830s and 1851, it is estimated that the Indigenous population of Victoria went down from 60,000 to 15,000. This is 3/4 of a population. The report highlights that this has happened through massacre, but also through disease, through sexual violence, through dispossession. And part of the report is also about redressing harm that is still ongoing with the Indigenous communities in Victoria. We're talking about incarceration rates, we're talking about education, we're talking about the stolen generation with children being taken away. So this report is very much not something about the past only. It's also about what is going on in Australia today with regard to the Indigenous populations, plural, and also Torres Strait Islanders.
And there are several debates around this, though. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes. Look, as a historian, you need to present both sides. The key contention here is about the word genocide and the use of that word. Genocide is a legal category, right? You've got a UN convention that defines it from 1951, and the convention clearly states that genocide is where you've got the intent to exterminate a group or a part of that group. That group can be conceived in ethnical ways or religious ways or cultural ways. Then you've got a different list of what applies for that definition. The killing. Killing is an obvious one. You murder a group or part of a group. But you also have linguicide, you also have cultural genocide, you also have removing children away from their group, preventing from having children, so for instance policies of sterilization. So all of these criteria, when you assess them against what has happened in Australia, some of them apply, others don't. On the other side of the debate, you'll have people who will say, well, in different states in Australia, there were protectors of Indigenous Australians. Now, this is a very loaded term because indeed they were trying to protect, but in 19th century ways, which were removing communities from their land, cutting them away, taking the children away. So that side of the argument is fairly thin. The reality is, regardless of the word that we use, whether the genocide word is correct or not, what matters to me as a historian is that people understand that there were massacres of Indigenous Australians, that many tens of thousands died of diseases during colonisation, and that this harm is not something that was done and just stays in the past. Today, incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians are not the same, life expectancy is not the same. These are not problems that have gone away.
And just as a kind of reminder for our viewers, because unfortunately it's not exactly a topic that we can talk about a lot here on France 24, it has been a very slow and fraught path towards reconciliation with Aboriginal Australians. It was only in 2008 that then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology to Indigenous peoples, particularly the stolen generations who, as you say, suffered from government policies like forced child removal and assimilation. Can you tell us a bit more about the kinds of efforts we've seen recently failed or succeeded towards reconciliation?
One big one is a recent referendum which was defeated in 2023, whereby all Australians were asked if they wanted to establish a body of Indigenous, exclusively Indigenous people who would have a say on legislation, who would just overlook what the Parliament would be doing and say, in this instance, Indigenous Australians support this legislation, or we think that we should do this and amend it. So it was a small path toward recognition and toward political agency. Australians voted that referendum no. So it's an ongoing process. I think what is important to remind to non-Australians is that in 1788, some people arrived from Britain. And that process started in New South Wales, in today's Sydney, and that extended and extended and extended. And as white colonisation expanded, Indigenous Australians were dispossessed of their lands. There is a wonderful website that I recommend everyone to use. It's called the Massacre Maps from the University of Newcastle, where you can use a map of documented massacres and look at where they were. The answer is they were everywhere and for decades across the entire Australian continent. So effort toward recognition are ongoing. Indigenous Australians have never been silent about this. They've resisted colonisation since day one. There was a big day of mourning in 1938, and NAIDOC that you've mentioned, the National Aboriginal Islander Day Observance Committee, has been going on for decades. It's not something of the past. Again, this activism is ongoing because the condition of a good deal of Indigenous Australians is different to that of national standards.
And what about, I suppose the question is, what is the way forward? I mean, you mentioned the voice referendum, which was struck down. It seems like even in modern day times, we really struggle to move forward with this. So what about, I suppose, the other so-called truth-telling commissions? You mentioned in the beginning that there was another one in another state that was cancelled by the new Liberal Conservative government. Where do we go from here?
It's a tricky question. I'm a historian and I look at the past rather than the future. But as someone who lives in Australia, what I can say is that there is more and more discussion about treaty. In New Zealand, for instance, there is a treaty between white New Zealanders and Maoris. This treaty was always negated to Australian, Indigenous Australians. Some members of the communities, and there are many Indigenous communities in Australia, would like that legal recognition as a first step toward more political agency, toward more decision-making about Indigenous affairs by Indigenous Australians. So it's a long road, and it's a road that has been trodden by Indigenous Australians for more than 2 centuries now. So there is no one, quick bullet solution to this issue. But the more conversation we have about the past, the more likely we are to recognise inequalities that endure in Australian societies, because colonisation is not a process that stopped 200 years ago. Dispossession is still ongoing. You do have legal cases of big mining companies taking Indigenous land, blowing up cultural sites. It is not something of the past.
Indeed. Thank you very much for your take, your analysis. Romain Fathi from the Australian National University.
Thank you very much.